Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to call to order the October 16th meeting of the State Allocation Board. If you could call the roll, please.
Certainly. Senator Hancock, Senator Liu, Senator Fuller, Assemblymember Buchanan, Assemblymember Hagman, Assemblymember Nazarian, Esteban Almanza,
Here.
Kathleen Moore, Cesar Diaz,
Here.
Irina Ortega.
Here.
We have a quorum.
So we will start with the adoption of the minutes from our August 20th meeting. Any move and second? Any public comment? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Minutes are adopted. And Lisa.
So 3 items tonight, and I'll keep it quick. There was a sale that occurred with the Treasurer's Office related to this bond program, and that sale occurred on October 7th, and this program actually did receive $73 million in bond proceeds. But those bond proceeds actually covered the projects that we apportioned back in August. So again, just to clarify, that sale did cover those projects in August, and just to remind those folks that we had allocated over $100.2 million, and those timelines to perfect and come in with contracts and the certifications need to come in by November 18th. And the fund releases related to that apportionment activity, rather dismal at this point in time, but I'm sure we're going to see a rush of projects coming through the door, but at this point in time we have about $23 million that's gone out the door out of that original $100 million. So again, we'll encourage and continue to outreach to those folks that to come in for this money. And to remind also folks that we have the priority of funding round opening up in November, and if you have an unfunded approval, you need to come in and provide the certification to us within that 30-day window. The last item I want to share is the regulations came into effect for those other programs for priority of funding, and that applied to the career tech projects and charter school projects and some overcrowded relief program projects. So if you have valid unfunded approvals on those lists, as we mentioned earlier, again, it's critical that you do submit the certification for that current round that's coming up. So we'll be reaching out to those folks, send an email blast to remind them of the certification requirements coming up.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you. And next we have the consent agenda.
Yeah, I do want to mention that there's a few items that we wanted to acknowledge that Los Angeles Unified, we had listed in the consent agenda. At this point in time, we're going to withdraw it, and that's on page 15 and 16. We're still working with the district and hopefully get those issues resolved. And then also, as part of the emergency repair approval that's submitted on page 54, although we're bringing forward $95 million for the board under consent agenda, there's a few items that we wanted to recognize. The district did submit Desert Sands that they would like to have those projects removed from the list at this point in time, so we won't award those projects. And they're currently on page 54 on attachment A. It's about slightly over $1 million. So acknowledge that the remaining emergency repair program projects will move forward with approvals, but the district specifically had a request to remove those projects from the consent agenda.
Okay. And I'd like to suggest that we move the items under tabs 9, 10, and 11. So the charter school facilities, new construction supplemental grant, the proposed regulations implementing Senate Bill 854, and the proposed amendments to the K-12 Audit Guide also to the consent, but I'm happy to take comments on that before.
Yeah, I just have a couple comments on item
Sure.
11.
Okay, on item 11 then. Go ahead.
Okay, I need to push this. We've talked several times, I know it's been a sort of a pet area of mine in terms of the performance audit and potentially including a couple other items, and my interest is particularly in those areas where over the years that I've served on the State Allocation Board, I've seen numerous appeals come before the board. And the two areas, one is labor compliance, and I really do believe when a district is going through the performance audit that auditor ought to be able to check a box or certify that the district is conforming with the labor compliance requirements. And I know now the labor compliance has been streamlined dramatically. It could change several years down the road. And it's tough when a district comes in then 5 years later and we find they haven't followed all the rules and we're trying to figure out how we can arrange funds. So that's one area in particular. And the other area where we've seen districts come in and have penalties is when they check the box to say that they are under contract when they're requesting the release of funds, and they actually haven't signed a contract. So we find out that we gave them the funds. It's been 9 or 12, or I think one we saw 18 months later when they actually had the contract for the funds. And so the penalty is that lost interest to the state that we would have had if we would have had the funds in our account. So I know there are some areas that we can't avoid in terms of appeals when districts want to move where they are on the list or things like that require board action, but I would like them to at least consider looking at a couple items like that can help us keep districts out of trouble down the road if an auditor could bring those items like that to the district's attention early on.
Preventive maintenance.
Preventive maintenance, correct.
So I also like to agree with those comments, Assemblymember Buchanan. And also on item 10, with the new regulations being set forth by Senate Bill 854, it's also important to understand that the new requirements now will actually apply to all public works projects. It is regardless of the funding source. So I'm looking at the chart, a wonderful chart and information that staff put together, but the chart on page 141 that talks about the funding sources. It's important to note that even if it's not funded directly from any statewide proposition, that school districts have to use contractors that are from this registry. If they don't, there could be severe penalties not only on the contractor, but you may have to replace that contractor with someone else that actually is eligible from that registry. That might cost school districts more, so I just wanted to kind of highlight that as a note for school districts to monitor that, because this program really starts next year.
And school districts have to do these Prop 39 audits regardless of whether or not there is a state program or they're participating in the program. So I just see this as one way of helping keep districts out of trouble.
So Lisa, let's see, you had some ideas about how to make sure the information that we put out on the labor compliance is very clear to folks, that this doesn't change other responsibilities they might have. So I think from the staff perspective, we will work on making sure that's clear in whatever we have on this. And then regarding the audit, you can incorporate those comments into the information we submit.
We can certainly share that with the Controller's Office, yes.
Great. Anything else from the members on these items? Any public comment?
I was just going to move it.
Any public comment on the regular consent agenda as proposed and then items 9, 10, and 11? Seeing none? We have a motion by Mr. Hagman, a second by Mr. Diaz. And I also want to make sure the record reflects that Mr. Nazarian is here. So we all in favor of approval of the consent calendar? Aye. Aye. Any objection or abstention? No, it's adopted. Thank you. And Lisa.
Yeah, we have the fund release update, and on page 72, we just want to acknowledge that in the month of September, we had $28.9 million that was released, and that's the highlight of that report. And if we move forward on the status of funds, it's what we're tracking as far as our bond funds. On page 76, primary activity has been obviously been shifted to some of the rescissions and closeouts, and so in summation, we had $2.9 million that have returned back to the program in the areas of new construction in both Proposition 1D and 55, and then also a charter school that also did rescind its project. So that's $2.9 million. And then in the activity of actual provided unfunded approvals, there were actually 2 career tech education projects that did move forward. And so for $4 million, and that actually results in no bond authority left in that program. So again, career tech education has no more bond authority, and so that results in $4 million of activity of unfunded approvals this month. And on page 77, just to reflect the emergency repair program activity, although we highlight this $95 million that is going to be awarded to projects, we'll modify that. Also, we'll modify the consent agenda to reflect about $94 million going out as opposed to as a result of the adjustments to the consent agenda. And that's what we'll share. That's it.
Okay. Any public comment on any of that? Any questions or comments from the board? No? Okay. That was it for status of funds as well, right? So
Yes,
we'll
we're done.
move to tab 12, which is the Seismic Mitigation Program report.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Lepask with the Office of Public School Construction. Back at the June 2014 board, the board asked us to convene the implementation committee to discuss the fall-off that we've been having. Projects have been proceeding through steps 1 and 2 at DSA. That's getting their eligibility and determination of rehabilitation or replacement of their buildings, and then they haven't been proceeding to step 3 in some cases. So the idea of that conversation was to hear from stakeholders as to why that's occurring. We had that conversation, and a number of things came up. One of the most noteworthy was how the minimum work is being determined. As you know, the seismic program can fund only the minimum work to mitigate the seismic threats. And currently, DSA does a review, and then OPSC does a review. And DSA's role is to really ensure that the plans that they contain the minimum work, and also that they are bringing the building up to code. The OPSC then goes through and does a review to ensure that it's just the minimum work that's being funded in the program. So there was some perceived redundancy there, and that maybe that there's some duplication in these reviews. So there's a few things that we think going forward will help with that. First of all, in May of this year, DSA updated their procedures for how they review those plans, and when they come in at step 2 to make the determination of replacement or rehab, they're going to be required now to submit 2 sets of plans if there's extra work. The first set would contain only the minimum work. The second set of plans would contain any of the extra work, so to help separate that out and make it a little bit more clear when it comes to us. Another thing that we're kind of bouncing around where we'd like to maybe try this out is a little bit more outreach on the front end. With the school district's design and facility staff, they would meet with us and possibly with DSA to discuss, kind of outline the expectations for what they can be expecting when they come into us for funding. And that way, it would address the concern that we've been having of districts coming out of DSA expecting a certain amount, and then when we come in and we look at the minimum work only, that amount might be reduced. And so that would eliminate that issue. Again, it's maybe not going to be a perfect solution, but it's something that I think will help us immensely, and try to give them more of a accurate representation of what we can fund before they design those plans and get them approved. Some of the other things that came up were the issue of reserving bond authority at the conceptual approval stage. And this came up in the context of a possible sweep of funds, of seismic funds, and kind of trying to set aside those funds ahead of time, and at a stage where the districts come to the board for conceptual approval and then carve the money out. That gives them an assurance that the funds will be there when they perfect their project and come in for funding. Another thing we discussed was prioritization of seismic reviews at DSA. DSA is willing to entertain this on a case-by-case basis. They don't want to prioritize typical projects because there is a responsibility to review the projects that they receive in the order that they're received, but they would, on a case-by-case, evaluate that. And another thing was partial seismic upgrades, and this would mean instead of having to come in with the full project where you do every single upgrade possible for seismic, and it might trigger some fire life safety or accessibility work, that's going to make the project bigger than maybe they would like to at that time, and it would impact their budget, and this way they can focus more on the issues that selective, maybe the most critical areas, and focus on those. There were some other topics as well. They're covered later in the item, having to do with engineering report costs and maybe providing those up front, or perhaps on the back end of more of a reimbursement for what is exactly spent on these. These structural engineering reports are a little bit more complicated than a standard project, and they do cost, we've been hearing, a lot more than possibly what the program is providing currently. We currently provide a percentage increase to the construction grant amount on the back end. The stakeholders were asking for maybe that to be provided up front or as a function of the actual cost of the reports. So that's our summary of what happened at Implementation Committee, and I can answer any questions that you have.
Well, first would be procedural. Having been here a while, it's been the tradition that the Assistant Executive Officer of the State Allocation Board, who operates the Implementation Committee, has oftentimes provided the report. So I'm very interested in what Bill Savage has to say concerning what occurred at the meeting. Obviously, a good report and a good write-up by staff, but it has been tradition that the Assistant Executive Officer has provided that report directly from what the stakeholders have indicated. And then secondarily, I'm curious about some of the further delving into some of the recommendations. And I know this is not an action item, it's an information item. So what are our steps for following up on some of these recommendations? And also there's been a legal opinion on a number of them, and I'm curious about if there's any room within those, because there seems to be a number of really good suggestions. And then my final comment is on the work. And as I understood the minimum work determination, certainly understand the state's role in capping costs. But we ask districts to deal with things holistically, and I'm really wondering are we in arguments about a holistic approach to a project, a seismic project that should be done, as opposed to, this little piece over here is going to be on the district, this little piece over here is on the state, this piece over here is additional. To me, that is not a holistic approach to a very complicated project. And then asking districts to have a separate project for the seismic and another set of plans for the non-seismic, or another differentiation, seems to be additional work. So I'm curious about developing that piece a little bit more, in the hopes that we really do approach seismic projects that are ostensibly a major safety concern of the state, and ensure that they are getting done in accordance with plans that are before the DSA.
So I think regarding the procedural questions, Bill, and I'll give you a chance in a minute to add anything you'd like to add. Regarding the kind of the summary that Brian has provided and those items, I think what we should do is ask staff to bring back a discussion of those items for, I would think January is probably the better time frame than December, just give them some time to actually work through them. And then the report can have some of this analysis about legal opinions, and also maybe a little bit of what may have been considered before and not moved forward with, et cetera. So good. Bring back the options like we've seen in some of the other issues that we've raised. And then on your final point about the holistic consideration of the project, I think that is a good context for which the staff can bring back the options. So if we're talking about looking at the minimum work versus the balance of the work, how much difference does it make in actually doing that division? Is it a worthwhile attempt to make the program more efficient, to streamline, et cetera? So I think that's exactly the context of which some of those options need to be brought back to us. Is, does it work, or are we just parsing the program out in a way that doesn't really make any sense, just to try to pick at pieces that people have concerns with? So I think those are helpful suggestions. Bill, before we have some more questions, let me just see, Bill, is there anything you want to add, either different from what Brian provided us or addition to?
No, I think the staff did a good job of presenting what we talked about. I would probably have a little bit different focus in some areas, but I think having the minimum work required discussion and having some follow-up on that item so that we can we don't want to have the situation that we're having now where one state agency says this much and another state agency says, that much. And it's confusing for districts, and it creates a project scenario that makes it more difficult, and districts have no idea what they're going to get when they go through the process. So I think that's probably the most important area that we need to focus on. There was one specific item that Brian didn't mention, actually, that's in the report, and which is, are there ways that we could accelerate cash for these projects, and so exempt the projects from the priority and funding process. And if there was cash available at the state, you had a seismic project, you already go to the top of the list. But in this case, if OPSC had residual cash amounts, go ahead and fund those projects immediately. Could save 6 or 9 months. So that was one other one. I think the entire focus that we heard from stakeholders was we need to make the program easier to navigate, and we need to make sure that we're really reflecting what it takes for a school district to do these kinds of projects. And it's not that you want to do a lot of modernization while you do these necessarily, although it's not a bad idea to do, as Ms. Moore said, a holistic project where you do seismic upgrade and everything together. But you're forced into situations by the extent of seismic work on many of these projects where you get into an area where it's sometimes hard for the agency to see that this really is minimum work that's required. So I think good discussion, and I hope we can carry through on some of the items that were requested. Thank you.
Mr. Agman? Sorry, John. Okay.
Thanks. And this is, I think, the quintessential problem with government, right? What we're talking about right now is we're such a diverse state and has so much to it that we always try to put things in boxes. The more boxes we build on top of each other, the more money and time it takes to go through them to actually do something. Obviously, I won't be here when this comes back for a report in January, but I would like it to see you have a great staff, you have a review board that can review things. Give the flexibility to the staff to make common sense persons. You can't put a formula out there. It's 50%, 20% seismic, 80% retrofit. We're doing this new building. You can't put everything in a box, and the formula so well that this handcuffs everybody, and that's what makes things confusing. But give the authority to the staff to say this makes sense, bring it to the board so it's open, transparent. Let the board say yes, let's do this and move on, but still some guidelines and boxes. And hopefully you can streamline the process going that way by letting your people in the business with the expertise behind it do what they should do and have that authority to do it.
Thank you. Assemblymember Buchanan?
Yeah. I wasn't a member of the Assembly in the last bond when we created the seismic program, but clearly if we're intended to be modernization or new construction, it would have been part of that program. I mean, it was intended to be its own program, and they're based on the work that we did on the seismic committee for close to a year, and then follow up going over program review. Was concern initially that because the dollars in the seismic program were limited, that we wanted to be sure we targeted the most at-risk schools. And so as a result, we set standards very high, and we went the first 6 years with only 2 projects, relatively small projects, being funded. And Mr. Savage and I are very familiar with that because one was in my school district and one was in his, and that was even after we had to adjust the shaking standards. So going 6 years without spending virtually any money, the question was asked, how are we going to start addressing these needs? And we spent time studying, and that's when we changed the requirements to basically move away from the rigid shaking requirements to be able to say, if the seismic risk creates a situation where the schools are not safe to be inhabited, then they will qualify for seismic funding. And when we went through the program, we really didn't talk about whether seismic should be used for modernization or new construction, but the idea is that you want to eliminate the structural risk to the schools, whether you can go in with a fix to an existing school or whether you need to tear down and build new classrooms. But the idea was to mitigate the structural risk to a school. And when I look at where we are now, I understand the holistic approach, But I do think this board ultimately is going to have to grapple with, are these funds there to deal with the seismic risk to a school, or are they there now to replace modernization or new construction funding that we're out of? Because if you do want to take a holistic approach, and I were a facilities manager for a school district, I might want to find some kind of seismic tie-in because there's no modernization money, and now I can get modernization money. So, and then we started getting into our discussion when we met, to go over the agenda, and we talk about the 3 steps. Yes, there are 3 steps, but when you start asking the deeper questions and you find out the step 1 takes about 2 weeks, step 2 is taking about 6 weeks with DSA. It's not, and you take a look at how long it takes to get a normal modernization or new construction project through DSA. I mean, there are more steps, but we all know that there are other projects that take time as well. So with that as the background, I do appreciate the work you've done with DSA, because I think anything we can do to expedite any project makes sense. And while maybe you can't expedite all of them, certainly if there are projects that we believe pose a real threat to the students in the classroom, I would expect that DSA would be able to expedite those projects. So my interest when I look at your report, I guess come down to 3 areas. One is in terms of streamlining, and anything we can do with DSA, I think still ensuring the same rigorous review makes sense. 2 is, we talked about you're being able to assemble a team to work with the district earlier, and I think that's critically important because we want to try and identify what that scope of work is and what's covered through the seismic program and what's covered through other programs. And the last area where I have interest is in allowing districts to go in and fix structural make structural fixes to a building to ensure the integrity without having to touch the whole campus. I think, and that's not because I don't believe that we should meet all the ADA requirements and everything else, but kids need to be in classrooms that are safe. And so for those, if we're not able to go in and do a full modernization, it doesn't make sense to me to leave a certain building seismically unsafe because we can't do it all. And so short of turning this in, holistic is better, but we're in a whole new world when it comes to construction funding, not having a bond on the ballot, forcing districts to reassess their resources. If I were on a school board right now, I probably would be saying, okay, if we don't have matching funds, which projects am I do, which am I not going to do? I don't want that to be an impediment to making a building structurally safe. So those are the 3 areas where I would like to see particular focus, and then, to the extent you bring this back to the State Allocations Board later and address the others, I think that's fine. But those 3 areas are what stand out to me in terms of areas where we could potentially move forward and make a difference for districts.
I think this is not an action item, right? We're just going to acknowledge acceptance of the report. I am going to ask if there is any public comment now on this item. I don't see any, so we'll move on to, thank you everyone for your comments, and we'll be talking about this again in January. Lisa.
We have the workload.
Yeah.
So if you want to, any comments in the workload report? Seeing none.
I think so. And just the information items?
Yes, just a list that we have on the back of the report. And
okay. Is there any other general public comment? Okay. Before we adjourn, we wanted to take a few minutes to thank and acknowledge a couple of our members who will not be with us at our next meeting, and also a staff member. So I'm gonna start with Assemblymember Buchanan and read the impressive statistics that the staff provided to me. So Assemblymember Buchanan has been a member of the board since July 2010, so I think she deserves some gratitude for that commitment, and has been the vice chair since January of 2013, and has assisted in apportioning over $6.6 billion in school facilities projects. There you go. So I think that's pretty great. And I think not only your knowledge and attention, but the amount of time that you've spent on the real details of understanding how the program works, I think is really to be commended. And also, this is something for both you, and I will say it for Assemblymember Hagman too, is the collaboration with which folks have worked, and especially the two of you on this committee, I think is really impressive in terms of bipartisanship and trying to get at the right answer and good policy, and I think that's been great. So we have a resolution for Assemblymember Buchanan. Yes. I'll present that to you.
Hold it up.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let everybody
There we
look
go.
at your... And Assemblymember Hagman, who has served as a member of the board from January 2011 to the present and assisted in apportioning $3.6 billion in projects. And yeah, again, as I mentioned, working so well with other members of the board, I really appreciate that. And also, just again, to point out your participation in the program review subcommittee, and I think all the folks who participated in that know full well the amount of time and detail that that effort takes and took. So, Mr. Hagman, thank you so much, and we wish you both well. We have a resolution for you as well. Thank you so much. And then Lisa is going to do our staff presentation.
Yes, Mr. Juan Morales, if you want to stand up. It's just to acknowledge, if you don't know, Juan Morales did accept a job in another entity, and so...
The Department of
the
Finance.
Department of Finance. Yes, I know, they like to steal. So appreciate Juan and his level of commitment to this board and to this organization. And we've been blessed and fortunate enough to have him in our organization for over 16 years. And he's, to some extent, has been a crux of knowledge. And I'm sure you'll serve Department of Finance very well, and we're going to miss you. Congratulations.
It's a plaque, Juan.
Sure. Yeah. It's going to be great.
You look taller.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other comments, anything to come before the board today? I don't see any other public comments, so with that, we'll be adjourned. Thank you, everyone.